By 1944, the relentless, grinding war on the Eastern Front had utterly exhausted the German Wehrmacht. The initial shock of the T-34 had long faded, replaced by the grim familiarity of an enemy that simply would not break. German tank crews, the elite of the armored corps, were hardened veterans who believed in the technical superiority of their machines. They had developed a cynical respect for their Soviet counterparts, knowing that victory now came at a devastating, agonizing price. The famous Tiger and Panther tanks, once symbols of invincibility, now faced overwhelming numbers and increasingly clever enemy tactics. Every patrol felt like a gamble, every engagement a desperate struggle to preserve their diminishing resources and their own lives. The vast, unforgiving landscape of the East, mud in spring and fall, deep snow in winter, constantly worked against German logistics and mobility. They were fighting a war of attrition that their industrial base could never truly hope to win against the massive Soviet production machine. The crews knew the odds were shifting, yet their training and doctrine demanded an aggressive, unwavering fighting spirit. They relied on the superior optics and powerful main guns of the Panther and Tiger to engage the enemy from long range, a desperate attempt to negate the Soviet numerical advantage. The radio chatter was less about triumphs and more about fuel shortages, maintenance breakdowns, and the constant, unnerving pressure of the enemy offensive. Their lives were a cycle of frantic, muddy battles, followed by rushed, often impossible field repairs, all under the constant threat of artillery and air attack. The German tankers lived with the knowledge that a new, more powerful Soviet tank could appear at any moment, a psychological burden as heavy as the armor plate they sat within. They had seen the Soviet Union adapt, learn, and grow stronger from the initial devastating blows of Operation Barbarossa. This weary anticipation, this heavy dread of the unknown Soviet response, settled deep into the psyche of every German crewman. They were the last line of defense for a collapsing empire, and they sensed the coming storm, the next great technical shock that would further erode their combat edge. The technical gap that had once favored Germany was now rapidly closing, leading to an environment of tactical surprise and continuous, deadly uncertainty. They felt the war slipping away, one grueling kilometer at a time, knowing the next Soviet innovation could be the one that finally sealed their fate. The appearance of any new Soviet design was not just a military problem, it was a deeply personal threat to their very survival on the battlefield. They understood that the relentless commitment of the Soviet Union to tank production would eventually lead to a design that their own formidable tanks could not easily defeat. The Soviet Union's decision to develop a successor to the legendary KV series tanks was a direct consequence of the shocking German Tiger and Panther introductions. Stalin's heavy tank, the IS-2, was named in honor of the Soviet leader, symbolizing a renewed commitment to offensive, heavy armor doctrine. Its design philosophy was simple and brutal: to create a tank with armament capable of destroying the best German armor at range and with protection that could withstand German tank guns. The development was an urgent, high-priority project driven by the desperate need to regain technical parity on the battlefield. Soviet designers in Chelyabinsk, known as Tankograd, worked in a relentless, almost feverish environment to bring the monster to life. They recognized that the 85mm gun, while a significant improvement over earlier calibers, was simply insufficient to consistently pierce the thick frontal armor of the Tiger I and the Panther. The solution lay in the massive 122mm D-25T gun, a weapon originally designed as a heavy artillery piece but adapted for the tank destroyer role. This colossal main gun fired a two-piece, heavy shrapnel round that inflicted catastrophic damage even when it did not fully penetrate the enemy's armor. The sheer kinetic force of the 122mm shell was often enough to shatter weld seams, buckle armor plates, or create deadly internal spalling, instantly incapacitating the crew. Its frontal armor was heavily sloped and impressively thick, making it extremely difficult for the long 75mm and 88mm German guns to reliably defeat it head-on. The tank's silhouette was low and its turret massive, giving it an unmistakable, intimidating profile on the distant battlefield. Despite its impressive firepower and protection, the IS-2 suffered from a slow rate of fire due to the two-part ammunition and limited internal storage for shells. These technical compromises were deemed acceptable in exchange for the overwhelming single-shot destructive power that the tank could bring to bear. The IS-2 was initially deployed in separate heavy tank regiments, held in reserve for breakthrough operations or to counter German heavy tank formations. It quickly earned the nickname "sledgehammer" among Soviet troops, reflecting its primary role in shattering enemy defenses. The new tank began to appear on the front lines in early 1944, a visible, tangible symbol of the shifting tide of the war. Its arrival was meant to not only provide a technical counter but also to inject a potent dose of confidence into the advancing Soviet forces. The tank represented the final phase of Soviet wartime industrial mobilization, showcasing an ability to manufacture a complex, powerful machine under duress. Its combat debut, characterized by shock and awe, would soon etch itself into the grim combat diaries of the German tank crews facing the Red Army's offensive. The first definitive accounts of a new, monstrous Soviet tank did not arrive as formal intelligence reports but as fragmented, terrified whispers over German field radios. Tank commanders would report encountering a machine that shrugged off the standard high-velocity shots from their Panzer IVs and even the formidable Panthers. These initial sightings were often dismissed by higher command as confused reports or overestimations from demoralized troops, a pattern common throughout the war. But the sheer consistency of the accounts, detailing a tank that looked different and possessed unprecedented resistance, slowly forced a grim re-evaluation. The descriptions coalesced around a few key, terrifying features: a massive, spherical turret, a sharply sloped glacis plate, and a main gun that looked impossibly large. Crews who survived an engagement against this new foe spoke of a deafening, terrifying impact that their armor simply could not contain. The chilling, technical term non-penetration was often accompanied by the equally grim reality of a shattered, burnt-out tank and a dead or wounded crew inside. German tankers were accustomed to fighting vehicles they could defeat. Even the Tiger had weaknesses that a skilled crew could exploit in combat. The IS-2, however, introduced a feeling of helplessness, a sense of facing an enemy that had suddenly become impervious to their standard attacks. The new tank quickly earned its own sinister nicknames among the German troops, often simply the Joseph or the Coffin Maker, in grim recognition of its power. One veteran was recorded saying, "We had never seen a gun like it. When it fired, you didn't hear a shell, you heard a thunderclap that shook the earth." The intelligence gathered from battlefield wreckage confirmed the worst fears. The IS-2 was armed with a colossal 122mm gun and protected by exceptionally thick, sloped armor. This was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, forcing German crews to change their entire tactical doctrine when this tank was reported in the sector. They could no longer rely on the long-range duels that had previously favored their superior optics and accurate 75mm and 88mm guns. The appearance of the IS-2 forced them to close the distance, to seek flanking maneuvers, and to rely on ambush tactics to exploit the tank's known, albeit few, weak points. Every report of an IS-2 sighting immediately raised the alert level to its absolute maximum, knowing that a direct confrontation was almost certainly a death sentence. The rumors had become a terrifying reality, confirming that the Red Army had finally fielded a heavy tank that surpassed anything currently available to the average German Panzer division. The initial battlefield shock was primarily a consequence of the immense destructive energy of the IS-2's 122mm high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. German tankers in their Panther and Tiger tanks were accustomed to the crack of high-velocity shells, a sound that often meant a clean penetration or a ricochet. The IS-2, however, delivered a blow that was fundamentally different, a colossal thud that translated into pure, terrifying concussive force. When a German tank was hit by the 122mm shell, even if the round did not fully penetrate the heavy armor plate, the effect was still devastating. The sheer force of the impact caused the interior surface of the armor, known as the spall, to fragment and fly off at lethal velocities. This deadly spray of red-hot metal shards acted like shrapnel inside the tank, instantly killing or severely wounding the crew and destroying delicate internal equipment. One German crewman described the hit as being struck by a battering ram, followed by 100 angry hornets of screaming, flying steel. The German term for this effect was Schockwirkung or shock effect, a recognition of the disabling, immediate psychological and physical trauma inflicted. The optical sights would often shatter, the radio equipment would be knocked out, and the finely tuned traversing gears of the turret would jam completely. A tank that was technically still operational could be rendered combat ineffective and unable to fight, its crew dazed, bleeding, and blinded. The massive high-explosive rounds, or HE, were particularly effective against the German armored fighting vehicles, especially tanks like the Panzer IV. A near-miss HE blast could easily destroy the tracks, the external equipment, or even tear off the entire turret from the less heavily protected German tanks. This meant that even a relatively poor shot from an IS-2 could still result in a kill or a mobility kill, something unheard of with the smaller German calibers. The sheer diameter of the 122mm shell meant the German crews faced a truly apocalyptic level of power that fundamentally changed the rules of their engagement. The surviving crews quickly relayed the horrifying truth: the frontal plate of the IS-2 was essentially impervious to their long 75mm guns at any realistic combat range. The only reliable way to achieve a kill was to strike the flanks or the rear at close range, requiring an impossibly daring and dangerous maneuver. The terrifying impact of the IS-2 on the Eastern Front was not just about armor thickness, it was about the colossal, destructive shockwave it delivered to its targets. The distinctive sound of the 122mm D-25T gun became a terrifying sound cue on the Eastern Front, a deep, earth-shaking boom that signaled immediate danger. The muzzle blast was so immense that it visibly distorted the air around the massive barrel, kicking up huge clouds of dust and debris with every single shot. This impressive concussion meant that the gunner's ears rang for hours, and the tank itself shuddered violently every time the primary weapon was fired. German crews quickly learned to identify this sound, an unnerving, authoritative roar that lacked the sharp, high-pitched crack of the German 88mm gun. The sound carried across the battlefield, serving as an auditory warning to any German unit that the heavy Soviet tanks were actively engaged in the area. The 122mm gun's shell trajectory was notably more arcing than the flatter trajectory of the German high-velocity weapons, an artillery characteristic that made it a superb bunker buster. This allowed the IS-2 to be used effectively as an assault gun against fortifications, capable of reducing concrete structures to rubble with a few well-aimed shots. The tank's primary disadvantage, the slow rate of fire, was a direct consequence of the immense size and weight of the two-part ammunition. The loader had to first place the heavy projectile and then separately insert the propellant charge, a time-consuming and exhausting process in the heat of battle. While this slowed the IS-2 down in a fast-paced duel, its unparalleled first-shot impact often meant a second shot was completely unnecessary against a German tank. The German crews understood this limitation, and they desperately tried to exploit the reloading window with aggressive, rapid counterfire. However, the IS-2's impenetrable frontal armor often allowed it to absorb the German counterattack while its crew patiently prepared the next devastating round. The psychological effect of watching a shell the size of a small beer keg hurtle toward your position cannot be overstated, inducing panic and breaking the will to fight. The IS-2 was not designed for the finesse of a tactical tank battle. It was engineered for brutal, overwhelming destruction on the first pass. It was a weapon that prioritized sheer destructive power over all other battlefield considerations, a pure expression of the Soviet tank doctrine. The sound of the 122mm roar was the voice of the Red Army's advancing power, announcing the terminal decline of German armor superiority. The initial reports from the field were characterized by a sober and grim realism, quickly recognizing the IS-2 as a qualitative threat unlike any previous Soviet design. German technical assessment immediately focused on the IS-2's frontal armor, which was deemed too thick and too well-sloped for reliable penetration at standard ranges. Tank commanders of Tiger and Panther units, who were used to being the kings of the battlefield, suddenly found themselves outmatched in a frontal engagement. The 75mm kilowatt K-42L-70 gun of the Panther, their most common long-range counter, struggled to defeat the IS-2's glacis plate, forcing them to find better firing positions. Even the legendary 88mm kilowatt K-36 gun on the Tiger I could not guarantee a kill, especially at distances over 1,000 meters, which was considered the German sweet spot. The German crew's verbal reports were filled with frustration, describing the Soviet behemoth as some moving bunker that simply shrugged off their best shots. One captured document quoted a German tanker lamenting, "We hit him 5 times, and he just kept coming, our rounds just bounced off like marbles." The German doctrine of fire first, penetrate first was now fundamentally challenged by a tank that could absorb multiple hits and return one devastating round. The crews quickly relayed the IS-2's key weaknesses, including the commander's cupola and the driver's port, hoping to find a vulnerability they could exploit. The slow rate of fire of the 122mm gun was the one major tactical relief, offering a critical window of opportunity after the IS-2 fired its initial shot. This meant the German response had to be swift, coordinated, and utterly merciless in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet tank's first shot. Commanders began immediately instructing their gunners to aim only for the lower hull or the side armor, knowing that a frontal engagement was largely futile. The tank crews also noted the IS-2's relatively poor mobility compared to the Panther, suggesting that flanking maneuvers could still be successfully executed in open terrain. The official German military intelligence quickly issued new anti-IS-2 tactical pamphlets, confirming the grave nature of the threat and revising engagement protocols. The appearance of the IS-2 forced a profound psychological and doctrinal shift, compelling German crews to abandon their sense of superiority in favor of caution and cunning. The most insidious weapon of the IS-2 was not its cannon but the profound and crippling psychological effect it had on the already strained German tank crews. Prior to the IS-2, the German tanker felt a distinct sense of security inside his Tiger or Panther, believing he possessed the finest armored vehicle in the world. The sudden realization that a Soviet tank could withstand multiple hits from their best guns and respond with a single, guaranteed kill was utterly demoralizing. This technical surprise fractured the German concept of battlefield superiority, replacing confidence with a gnawing sense of vulnerability. The common refrain among the defeated crews was a simple, defeated question: what is the point of fighting a tank that cannot be killed? The sheer terror of the 122mm shell impact, the crushing concussion and the deadly internal spalling made every encounter an immediate, terrifying rush of adrenaline. Tankers began to exhibit signs of combat fatigue and psychological stress, including jumpiness at loud noises and a reluctance to close with the enemy. The IS-2 was not just a tank, it became a symbol of the Soviet Union's unrelenting, overwhelming industrial and military might. For the ordinary German soldier, the appearance of the IS-2 confirmed that the end of the war was rapidly approaching, and it would not be in their favor. The sight of a destroyed German tank, its turret blown clear off the chassis, a common effect of the 122mm He round, served as a stark, horrifying reminder of the enemy's power. Morale, already low due to constant retreat and endless defensive battles, plummeted further with the introduction of this seemingly invincible foe. The German command attempted to counter this decline with propaganda touting new anti-tank weapons and emphasizing the IS-2's supposed flaws. However, the reality on the front line was impossible to deny, and the word of mouth from surviving crews spread the terror far faster than any official communique. This psychological toll meant that German crews often hesitated, delayed their counterattacks, and sometimes even abandoned their positions at the mere report of an IS-2 presence. The German army was now fighting not only against a superior machine but against the growing, crippling fear of a tank they could not reliably destroy. The introduction of the IS-2 necessitated an immediate and profound tactical overhaul within the German panzer and heavy tank units operating in the East. The established doctrine of long-range, deliberate tank duels, where the Tiger and Panther reigned supreme, was officially abandoned in theaters facing the new threat. German commanders were forced to return to the older, more desperate tactics of ambush, concealment, and coordinated, close-range attacks. The new orders emphasized seeking flanking positions to engage the IS-2's significantly weaker side and rear armor, requiring much greater maneuverability. Tank hunter detachments, equipped with the formidable Jagd Panther and Elephant tank destroyers, were prioritized for deployment to areas where the IS-2 was active. These tank destroyers, with their even longer-barreled 88mm guns, offered the only reliable, long-range chance of penetration against the IS-2's frontal plate. Coordinated attacks became essential, with one German tank acting as a decoy or drawing fire while a second, better-positioned tank attempted a decisive side shot. The German infantry, often forgotten in the tank versus tank engagements, were now given explicit instructions to engage the IS-2 at very close range with Panzerfausts. While the tank's thick armor made a direct infantry kill difficult, the close-range attack could disable the tracks or force the crew to button up completely. The Germans also began to utilize artillery observers more effectively, directing heavy howitzer fire onto the IS-2 to immobilize it and force its abandonment. Every IS-2 casualty became a massive intelligence victory, with German recovery teams meticulously examining the wreck to find any potential structural weakness. The slow rate of fire became the ultimate tactical key, and German crews trained rigorously to quickly traverse and fire immediately after the IS-2's initial shot. The new reality demanded that German tankers fight smarter, more aggressively, and with a greater sense of teamwork than ever before. The days of leisurely, dominant tank engagements were over, replaced by a desperate scramble for tactical advantage against an enemy that held the upper hand in protection and firepower. The military hierarchy in Germany immediately understood that a technological gap had opened, and they urgently commissioned a solution to the IS-2 problem. The current standard armor-piercing rounds, while excellent against previous Soviet tanks, were proving wholly inadequate against the IS-2's revised, sloped armor scheme. The primary German response was the accelerated development and fielding of the specialized tungsten-cored shot, the PZGR 40-43, for the powerful kilowatt K-43 gun on the Tiger II. This highly advanced, scarce, and expensive ammunition was designed to deliver a concentrated, high-velocity punch to defeat the heaviest Soviet armor. However, the supply of tungsten was severely limited due to Germany's shrinking industrial base and constant Allied bombing, making the new round a rarity on the front lines. Tank crews were strictly ordered to conserve this precious PZGR 40-43 ammunition, using it only when absolutely necessary and only against the heaviest enemy tanks. The shortage of specialized ammunition meant that most German crews were still forced to rely on the standard rounds, exacerbating their feelings of helplessness. They were fighting a technologically advanced enemy while being starved of the necessary technical countermeasures due to strategic industrial failures. The German ordnance teams also attempted to develop new high-explosive anti-tank rounds, or heat, which relied on chemical energy rather than kinetic force for penetration. While heat rounds are technically effective regardless of the muzzle velocity, they proved to be less accurate and slower to develop for the large German calibers. The technical specifications of the IS-2 were rushed back to Germany, where ballistic engineers worked frantically to find a flaw in the massive tank's design. They studied the angles of the sloped armor, looking for a way to increase the chance of a penetration with a standard round by striking a specific seam or weld. This quest for a superior round became a race against time, as the Soviet offensives pressed further and the number of IS-2 tanks on the front line steadily grew. For the German tank crews, the promise of new, effective ammunition was a distant hope, while the very real, immediate threat of the IS-2 was a daily reality. The urban fighting that dominated the final years of the Eastern Front proved to be the IS-2's natural, terrifying habitat, where its strengths were maximized. The tight, rubble-strewn streets and the constant threat of close-range ambushes eliminated the IS-2's primary weakness, its slow rate of fire. In city fighting, engagements rarely took place over long distances, making the long reload time less of a critical factor for the Soviet behemoth. The 122mm gun, with its immense high-explosive shell, was an ideal weapon for clearing fortified buildings, rubble blockades, and entrenched anti-tank positions. A single He round could vaporize a German machine gun nest or completely collapse a cellar from which German infantry were mounting a defense. German infantry units equipped with the Panzerfaust, the most effective short-range anti-tank weapon, found themselves facing a nearly impossible challenge. The IS-2's thick, sloped frontal armor made it exceptionally resilient to even a perfectly aimed Panzerfaust shot, which often simply failed to penetrate the massive steel. The German crews fighting their own tanks in these urban meat grinders were constantly exposed to side-on attacks from the IS-2 emerging from behind buildings. The tight confines of the city negated the German Panthers and Tigers' advantage of long-range accuracy and superior optics. Instead, the battles became brutal, chaotic brawls where the sheer thickness of armor and the power of the gun were the deciding factors. German crews often resorted to desperate, improvised tactics, such as coordinating with snipers to target the commander's exposed head during a city advance. They also attempted to lure the IS-2 into pre-mined alleyways or onto collapsing bridges, trying to achieve a mobility kill rather than a destructive one. The IS-2 became a terrifying, unstoppable battering ram in the final assaults on cities like Budapest, Königsberg, and Berlin. German crews' accounts of these city battles spoke of a nightmarish, close-quarters slugging match where survival often seemed a matter of sheer luck. The appearance of the IS-2 in a city sector was the final, devastating indicator that the German defenses were utterly doomed to a violent, final collapse. The IS-2 was not the most produced tank of the war, nor was it the most mechanically reliable, but its impact on the battlefield was utterly transformational. It fundamentally shifted the technological balance of power back toward the Soviet Union in the critical heavy tank category during the war's final phase. The tank's performance irrevocably altered the German military's perception of Soviet industrial and design capabilities, instilling a new level of fear and respect. Its design philosophy, massive gun, heavy sloped armor, influenced post-war tank development in virtually every major military power for decades to come. The IS-2 forced the German army to devote enormous and increasingly scarce resources to developing new anti-tank guns and specialized ammunition. This diversion of effort was a strategic victory for the Soviets, draining German resources from other, equally critical theaters of operation and production. It served as a clear, irrefutable sign that the days of German tank superiority were conclusively over, marking the end of an era in armored warfare. The tank's operational use demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of a heavy assault tank when used to break through deeply entrenched defensive lines. Many surviving German veterans who wrote memoirs of the final battles often cited the IS-2 as the tank that finally broke their will to continue the fight. The tank became a powerful, enduring symbol of the Soviet victory and the Red Army's technological advancement during the most crucial phase of the war. The lessons learned from countering the IS-2 were directly applied to the development of the final German tank designs, notably the powerful but late-arriving King Tiger. The IS-2's legacy lies not just in its own combat record but in the profound, irreversible change it wrought on German tactical thinking and morale. It solidified the belief that the arms race for tank development had fundamentally changed, prioritizing massive firepower and impenetrable protection over all else. The scattered, often frantic words of German tank crews facing the IS-2 tell the true story of the final, decisive power shift on the Eastern Front. Their accounts were not just tactical reports, they were testimonies to the end of German armor dominance and the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The initial shock was soon replaced by a grudging, weary respect for a machine that represented the Red Army's inexorable advance. The IS-2 was the final piece of the Soviet military's overwhelming puzzle, a tank designed to destroy not only enemy armor but also the enemy's fighting spirit. It embodied the Soviet Union's total commitment to victory, an unwavering industrial effort that simply produced a bigger, more powerful weapon than the Germans could match. The German crews' desperate pleas for better ammunition and more powerful guns were a tacit admission that their own technological edge had been completely eroded. They were now fighting a purely defensive war, reacting to the Soviet initiative and constantly struggling to find a weakness in the enemy's formidable arsenal. The IS-2 was a brutal, physical manifestation of the fact that for the first time in the war, the German tank crew was on the back foot. The fear of the 122 mm cannon, the shock of the shell's impact, and the futility of frontal engagement defined their final combat experiences. The arrival of the IS-2 served as the historical punctuation mark on the failure of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. It was a machine that demanded entirely new tactics, new weapons, and an impossible level of courage from the crews who were forced to fight it. The tank's legacy is a grim but honest account of how a single, powerful piece of technology can completely alter the psychological and physical balance of a massive conflict. The scattered comments of the German crews, filled with dread and frustration, serve as the most authentic, painful chronicle of this decisive shift in power.